But have you read that one before? Or?
I remember when you gave it to us back then, so I did read some of it, but it's quite a way back, so
Yeah.
I don't have it memorized now.
No, neither have I.
Okay.
But I know I spent some time talking about the biological activity of that resulted in got photographs of worm casts and things like that. But I didn't take a photograph of the sheet of worm cast.
Mm-hmm.
That was, I reckon, 2 centimetres, built up 2 centimetres in the course of 90 days after the rain started, using the preparation 500 followed, well, by 501, and if he'd been open to it, I would have used etherics, but he went, all bloody water, you know. No, there's far too much cost for what it is. So I used preparation 500 and potentized that to the 5th potency, which anything to do with calcium seems that, and you look at Kalisko's work, that the series in 5 seems to do with calcium, and so it's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, whereas Steiner mentions that you could potentize lime to the 10th potency and it would do the same job.
Said Steiner.
It's in the agricultural course.
Oh.
The spiritual renewal of agriculture. And he said you don't need to put these tons and tons of lime on. In Britain they don't use lime, but oh boy is their soil compacted, particularly the biodynamic ones. And they need lime like a man dying of thirst needs a drink of water. You know, that with electrolyte in. So
then we could take chapter by chapter, we could read it, and then go through it and see
yes,
what
and
add to it.
see what's still current or
Yeah.
what has become more current. Maybe juggle them around a bit, and then and then we need to add enough to it that it's not the same book.
Right.
And
this will
put
be
other
no
chapters
problem.
in. You know, there could be a chapter or two of the climate robust farm,
Yeah.
or climate resilient farm, and that of course could be different in Europe to what it is here. But I'm sort of more au fait with the pastoral farm and the animals involved, and of course from old Europe, every farm grew everything, and 100 years ago, in Count Kaiserling's place, they grew most of their own food, as well as their major crop, which happened to be sugar. You know, sugar beet was their income earning, and they had a sugar factory attached to the farm. So I think there were 17,000 acres, which is quite a reasonable parcel of land in that part of the world. And so the counts, you know, the people of on the top end of the social tree had quite a bit of money.
There's a really big bumblebee. And he was already there yesterday for dinner. Now it's up there on the flower. Do you see him? Yeah.
All right.
I think it's quite big.
Yeah.
Just bumbling around.
Like twice as big as a normal bumblebee.
Yeah, well, that's not as big as they get, but it is a good sized one.
Yeah.
And when we were kids, we one of the neighbours' boys, about my age, said, "I'm going to save a bumblebee," but to save the bumblebee, he more or less drowned it until it was totally comatose, and then he put it in a little dish of salt and rubbed salt all over it, and of course the salt sucked all the moisture out again, and away the bumblebee shook himself and off he went.
Oh.
"See, I've saved the bumblebee!" But you had to kill it first.
No. Yeah, so if we were to do that, Peter, then would you want to prepare, or should we just take, a couple of days and say, we're just gonna read the chapter in the morning, and then we just talk about it.
Yeah.
And then we take one chapter after another and see how far we get.
Well, we need to also look and say what is still topical. And then if it is to go into Europe, it needs to be more general than focusing on pasture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because there's hardly any farms that are pasture only in Europe, I would think. There might be some that are pasture dominant, but...
The Irish, perhaps?
Well, yes, Ireland is a very
France.
wet place. It's not a place where you want to do much cropping,
Yeah.
apart from potatoes.
And in France there are some regions where there are a lot of beef,
Yeah.
cattle.
Well, there are lots of people there to eat it.
Yeah.
And so whatever sells,
Yeah.
farmer will produce. And there seems to be lots of space taken up by tractors these days too, judging by the number that got out on the highways and for the protest.
I think also Litauen, Estland, these countries, more grass, Finland.
Never been anywhere near Finland.
I wasn't there, but we have, what we get from them is it's mostly for cows,
Reindeer steak.
used for cows. We weren't there.
Reindeer steak.
Reindeer steak, yeah, like this. And
Like in Australia produces
parts of Sweden
kangaroo
too,
tail soup.
parts of Sweden too, and a lot of Norway.
Yes, well, Norway's got a lot of pretty steep country and small
Yeah.
parcels of flatter land,
Yeah.
I would imagine. So it's and they have these very long winters.
Yeah.
Very dark.
So it's different. It's really different to the southern parts, the midst of France.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we could, I think to make it more general is a good idea, and we could always, like in the appendix, put a chapter specifically for New Zealand.
Yep.
So then that could be in there as well.
Wouldn't say it is in this way. It would say this is what I experienced in New Zealand, and what happens perhaps in other countries too.
Yeah.
I think we will figure that out
Yeah.
as we go.
Yeah. But I mean, one thing I learned to do when I was in Europe, which was nearly 60 years ago now, coming up to 60 years, was I learned to be able to pick a biodynamic farm by driving past it. And it was particularly evident when I was looking for Podolinsky's farm up in Australia, and it drove in there, and the light just shone out of it. It was evening, and the light was low, but the whole place just glowed, and it was just so different from anything else around it. was a very clever man in other ways too, and his clients that he advised, when they made hay, if they were on irrigated land with border dike irrigation, he would get them to flood the land a week before they wanted to make the hay. And so that the ground was still saturated, but well, not quite saturated with water, but it had an adequate water supply in. The neighbours, of course, wouldn't see it. And then they'd cut the hay and make it, and the grass would just straight sprout out of the ground again. And the others, they couldn't figure out what this biodynamic trick was.
Water.
And of course, he'd probably spray it with, they'd spray it with 500 or, and when I was there, he was pondering over how he got the other preparations involved. And I said to him, well, one way is when you've got this barrel of 500, that you just put preps in like you do in a compost, and then you've got them all active. And so he did that, and followed that suggestion through. And so for a while there, and the manure changed totally, became more like compost, and a bit like what we call, compost pit preparation, CPP. Fra Maria called it barrel manure, but then the barrel collapsed, and then she made an enclosure on the ground and put it in there. And so what Podolinsky then did was probably one of the first instances of what you might call barrel manure. But where in Germany, what was I saying? What was the lady that did the calendar? Maria Thun.
Oh, yeah.
She was faced with the problem of, we all used to make liquid manure in a barrel. In the summer, of course, you take some of the liquid manure out, the level would drop, and then the staves would dry, and then it would leak if you're trying to fill it up again. And so she thought, well, I'll fix this. And so she put a lot more manure in and only a little bit of water so that it couldn't leak. And put the preps in that, and that I think is what became what she called barrel manure. And then, of course, what happened after a short while, that the staves decomposed and all came apart, so the whole thing collapsed on her. And so she took all the staves and made an enclosure using the broken, the staves. The ring didn't get used anymore. And then they still rotted, and so they finished up with bricks. And Peter Proctor here picked up on that, and but instead of putting the bricks above ground and putting a dish in underneath it, he dug a pit, put the bricks into ground level, and that became, the compost prep, compost pit preparation, CPP.
Because of India, it's travels in India. In India, it's tropical, and you have to do all in the ground.
Yep.
Otherwise, it burns away.
Yep. But not in the temperate climates.
Yeah, not in the. You have to come up.
So what I've done, the way I've done it, is to make a wok-shaped dip
Yeah.
dish in the ground with a shovel
Yeah.
and put that dirt aside, and you work out how much manure you've got and how big you make
Yeah.
the wok-shaped dish, and then you use some of that soil to just build it up a little bit above the ground, and then you mix your manure in the usual way with the special sand and or volcanic stone sand and eggshells and various things like that, and then you mix it until it becomes like a sort of a dough,
Yeah.
and then you try to get it as close as possible into the shape of an eggshell, because there's something really special about the shape of an egg, quite apart from being easier for a chook to lay than a cubic egg, and it has a dynamic inside it that is different to anything else. But you can try and make this eggshell shape, but unfortunately the manure slumps and it gets more like a donut. And but I still make it because I make it round, so there's no corners. There's very few places in nature where you find cubes and corners, right angle corners.
Do you use river sand or beach sand?
It's a volcanic sand that has a high light transmitting capacity, and
The beach sand, there are too much shells in. What?
Well, there's a special measure for it that measures light transmitting capacity, and when it goes through that composting process, the capacity it has multiplies by about 100. So with this cowpat pit, it can become, or cow manure heap, prepped cow manure heap, it can become a very potent spray, particularly if it's used a bit on the heavy side.
And the cow pad, follow the same instructions as for the 500.
It's the only thing that doesn't go into it is the 500.
Yeah, but if you collect from a pasture the manure.
Yeah, well, wherever you can get the manure, and it's better out of a pasture where the cows are relaxed than in a yard where they're anything but relaxed most of the time. And so the better the quality of the manure, the better the quality you're going to get out at the end. But the whole process is an art and a science. And it needs to be done with feeling, with gratitude, with understanding, with an integration with all the energies of, as Steiner says, spiritual renewal.
Yeah.
And so we have to honour the world of spirit in this process, because we are trying to improve this process in the quality, in the quality and quantity of our produce. And that's part of that whole process. And he also says quite pointedly that a farmer that's not profitable won't be a farmer for long. So so you need to...
Could be one sentence in front of the book. Steiner says, and the Steiner community is really shocked when you bring out a book with this quote.
Yeah.
He's materialistic.
It isn't materialistic. Money and spirit are very closely connected.
Yeah, no, it was a joke. That
Yeah.
materialistic in that in that
But-
healthy way.
Yeah, but but spirit, matter should be full of spirit.
Yeah.
And spirit with matter, and
It's also
the two.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the spiritual renewal of agriculture 100 years later is what it you
Normally
might say.
it was the opposite, so the spirit is empty and the materialistic world without any spirit.
Yes, but that's what they're working for, and Ahriman wants to take the spirit and harden it, hammer it the harder, and so that the spirit is materialized.
Yeah.
And he points several times to where the United States is now as being that place where materialism can work to its optimum. And I think that is part of the reason why the Europeans who've gone to America have taken over the Anglo-European cultural role. But from observation of what's happening now from a distance, I see that this period is now drawing to a close. And when periods draw to a close is when evil is manifested, because abilities outstrip moral quality or moral ability. And so when you've got cleverness outstripping moral duty, moral behavior, and then that is where the evil where the action becomes evil. That you are taking away from where we should be going, but the positive angle on it is that by creating this opposite, this from where we should be going, we've actually got to become more conscious and more discriminating, and making active will choices. First of all, thinking, feeling and willing, they need to be active, and this, what Ahriman's creating for us at the moment in materialism, is something that acts as a resistance in the same way that a bodybuilder needs a resistance. A weightlifter needs a resistance. He uses weights, and he develops his muscles and other skills to overcome the gravity of the weight. And
so Bill Gates is a bodybuilder.
So this is the spiritual muscle that's being developed to overcome what is being thrust at us as materialism. So if that wasn't there, then people would just glide along like jellyfish and not make any effort, because the current would carry them. And for humanity to go forward to our eventual task of being carers, as in our guardian angels are at the moment, we have to work. I mean, what we were discussing in Knowledge of the Higher Worlds today is about diligence and work, not about having a nice social gathering where we can all chatter. And have a cup of tea or coffee or whatever. It's about actually doing work that is set out by a teacher, and we have to be diligent with it, and not scoff at it. That and this comes right through to our guidance of agriculture, to bring these qualities into there, because that is where our food comes from. And we all know that food materials should be grown with love, harvested with love, and thankfulness, and cooked and prepared with love. And then this quality then shows through in the nutritional quality that comes to people as the result of eating. And people know that if you want to get indigestion, you take it from a cook who's in a hurry and gets angry with his staff. So, and that more than anything else will give you indigestion on the day. And so it's important that the spiritual wisdom be taken into all our practices, including agriculture, and everything that is to do with nutrition.
Die Schuhe kannst du hier reinstellen, dass sie nicht nass werden.
Dann braucht man die Füße nicht waschen. Und die Gummistiefel voll mit Wasser ist. Yeah, so that I think is the incremental increase in the tone of the book that we need to be looking at, is and to be able to put it in a language that the man on the street can understand.
Ja.
And
So the title is very important, isn't it?
Yes.
well, I mean, one I was suggesting was
Say biodynamic
was
as
Earth
well.
and Sky. You know,
Yeah, and then it will have a subtitle. You know,
Yeah.
that kind of.
the spiritual renewal of agriculture.
Yeah, for example.
That's disappeared altogether now. Can't go over there. No. You see,
Watering the fairy house.
It's okay.
over there,
Getting close.
my granddaughter, she sort of denies all. She used to be sort of quite sort of reckon she saw fairies, and now of course she scoffs at the ideas. But when I suggested to her that she might like to help me sort of design a nice place here and things, and she immediately thought of having a little sort of fairy garden just over there,
That looks good.
which turned out, well, I've always thought that was a sort of special place.
Yeah.
And I sort of doused it. She's actually on a little energy line there, so interesting.
Great. Yes. Well, good.
So I think that's the theme
Yes. Yeah.
that I'd like to take it, so that it's a step forward from what was done before.
Right.
But we need to probably have some places in there where practical measures can be undertaken, how you bring this. And then I think I've also in the other one discussed the ways in which one can work.
Yeah.
You know, that some people have worked well for a long time with the direct stirring of what is extracted from the ground, and then the Kaliskos began the work of homeopathy, which was at the time encouraged by Dr. Steiner, and he mentions it on page 90 of one of the lectures on agriculture, about how important it is to work with the smallest entities, and of that he's referring to homeopathy, and at that stage it was decimal homeopathy rather than centesimal or millennial, and when you talk to a farmer, and anything less than a shovelful is not to be considered. It's just not a non-entity. But what we've got to look at is how we use matter to carry energy, and in this case with homeopathy we're using pure water to carry the energy, and we imprint the energy as a memory in the water, and we use a tiny little bit of alcohol to preserve it, to maintain it so that it doesn't go off. And so that is the very beginning of diluting it into homeopathy.
Now we have also a different understanding. That most of the farmers a different understanding of the capacity of the memory in water. Most of them know the work of Emoto and so on.
Yeah, but they didn't when we started this.
Steiner, they had no awareness of this.
Yeah. So what we're doing is creating an imprint in water, so that we're taking the energy of each of the preparations and imprinting it in water. But then it goes one stage further, where by intent or working inwardly as a spiritual being, as a human spiritual being, that we can transmit through in a radionic fashion. We all know about radios and how they can transmit in a different way in different elements. And I've had the experience of seeing how a plant can receive a radio wave.
Yeah.
That I went to a place where this radio station's broadcast was just about imperceptible, and I had the radio on full volume to get some of it, and I parked the car under a tree at the coast to protect it from the elements, and as soon as the aerial touched the tree, the blast of noise from the radio was such that I had to turn the key off very quickly to save my ears. And so that was one of my aha moments, to realize that trees receive, and with it the thought came that if it can receive it, it can probably also broadcast it. And so radionics, as transmitted by a variety of boxes with different frequency modulations in them, Hugh Lovell made a transmitting post using copper wire and some radio, old crystal radio pieces, and a receiving well connected to a broadcast tower above and below, so it could be broadcast through the soil and broadcast into the atmosphere. In my experience, the area covered by such a device is fairly limited, but I have also experienced a broadcast from a large tree that went intercontinental, sort of almost halfway around the world. But it requires spiritual activity by humans to direct this process, much more active and conscious than when you are using the materials, the preparations directly from the soil. And then dealing with the preparations, I think we need to say how these herbs that are used are ensouled. The soul quality of the herb is increased. Whether you call it astral or soul depends on your audience. But I think the concept of soul is more generally understood. But perhaps one could have a paragraph or two about what drives the fluid in our body, and connect it with the word etheric, or life force energy. That governs our water body. And then we have the soul, which has three main parts, that governs our air body. And we all take breath into ourselves and we exhale breath. And the air that comes in has a different quality to that which goes out again. So apart from the fact that one has more oxygen and the other has its oxygen tied to carbon as carbon dioxide, so those thoughts need to be structured in a way that they lead people in a structured way to accepting the idea that's put forward.
Yes.
So that they're not suddenly dropped in the deep end and then you explain how it happens, but you start from what is obvious to observation, and give it names, and so that people can see from a logical perspective how all this fits in. And then to just skip a minute to go back, the first chapter really needs to be a synopsis of the book, of what we're going to talk about, and then the last chapter, a summation of what we have talked about. And somewhere in the process we need to mention that Steiner's little quote that's quoted by Enfield Pfeiffer, where Steiner said to him, "What I have spoken about at the Spiritual Renewal of Agriculture course needs to be practiced throughout the world. It needs to be a general practice all over the world. The world needs it, and we need it so that people can think spiritual thoughts. They can, think as human beings who are have a spirit coordinating various aspects of matter, and so that needs to come in to be included in some way that gives us build up, but to a certain degree a comment of it needs to be made in the introduction, and then we explain it a bit more in the summation, and draw it together, because very often at a certain level, if you understand something really well, you can say it all in one sentence, or maybe two. If you understand it a little, you can write 1,000 words and it's still not enough, or 1,000 pages. I mean, it's still not enough. So the prologue and the and the epilogue, or at the end, need to be that concise expression of what can one expect to find in this book, and then what we have discussed in the book, and so we need to work through that, and but we need to, I think, also structure that around what you perceive to be needed by people. I mean, you're writing courses for people. What do people need to know? I mean, in the other book I've got a chapter on the principal elements that are needed in agriculture, and then I think there's another chapter where I tie them in with the preparations, and so that they can be understood together.
I would talk about the poisonous substances from outside and how the system reacts to them.
Yeah.
How to deal with them.
Right.
Because it's a fact, we have it.
So, yeah, and dealing with poisonous substances, we need to draw attention to the fact that we and our animals thrive on a protein made up principally of the 22 amino acids in that particular sector, and that the nitrates at one end and the ammonias at the other end are both toxic and burdensome for us and our animals, and lead to a mitigation or a diminution of the amount of oxygen we can oxygenate our bodies with. And we were talking this afternoon about energy. The oxygenation of our system has a lot to do with the physical energy that we have, and sports people all know about that. And the sprinters are those who use up all the oxygen and then recover later. The long distance or long performing sports require oxygenation to be ongoing, so they have to maintain, I mean, particularly rugby and marathons and things like that, that you need to learn how to oxygenate your system on the way through and balance that out. So that's the physical energy, and then of course we've got the spiritual energy as well, the capacity to organize yourself, and there's lots of talk about world control. What we need to develop now is self-control, and so we control the world by 1/10 of a billion at a time, assuming there's 10 billion people. And this is where we need to push forward in development, and that is important in the carrying out of the work of the spiritual renewal of agriculture, to give us the capacity to actually follow through and do the things we need to do, to be able to understand why we're doing it. That it's not an accident, it's not a fad, it's something that humanity needs to do, and humans come to the earth because they can experience and work in ways that they can't work in any other place. You can't go to Mars and a Mars body and do what we're doing here with an Earth body. that's unique, and therefore we need to look after Mother Earth until all of us have had an opportunity to do the spiritual work that we need to do, and we owe it not only to ourselves but to all humanity. And this is one of the reasons why what was given to us and currently called biodynamics needs to be practiced widely through all our food systems, and particularly in the soil. So
I would say one topic I wish to have in the book is about the extremes of the climate. We go into drought or flooding. How to handle this to come back to balance.
right, that's another whole segment, a big segment.
It's a big segment.
And as you go with the use of poisons and water-soluble elements that don't require the activity of biology in the soil becomes collapsed. It becomes harder, it becomes denser, it becomes waterproof, eventually becomes hydrophobic, that water won't soak into it at all. It runs off glass with an oil coating over it. That's the extreme that we're coming to. What we need is when the rain falls on land, that the soil opens up and sucks it all in and holds it. And this is a special function of carbon, especially when it's in a living form known as humus. That and then the earth should be vegetated in such a way that it has large and small and a larger variety as possible. And trees in particular, and amongst those particularly the deciduous trees, some of them in the mature form have the capacity on a hot, dry summer's day to transpire up to 20 tons of water in one day. And we all know that evaporation and transpiration are a cooling process. So in the right proportion of trees throughout our environment, we have self-regulating temperature control, because the hotter it gets, the more they transpire, and in such a way that by having lots of green things, that we are able to build our own automatic temperature regulators, and that require no day-to-day management of human beings, but it does require a lot of effort in getting them established in the first place, and integrating our agricultural activities within and around them. 100 years ago, all the fields were small and they were surrounded by hedgerows of multiple species. Different parts of the world have different hedging plants, that many of which are edible by our domestic animals. 100 years ago, when they went into such an enclosure, the middle bit might be cultivated, but when the cows went in there, they always went to the borders where it wasn't cultivated, and there was the wide variety of often native species native to that particular part of the world, and they were what the animals ate first, and then they would go into the middle of the paddock or field or enclosure to eat what was left, so these systems, the living systems, enable moisture to circulate, to be held, and there's some concern about rising oceans. Now, if we are able to hold more moisture in our soils and develop a secondary hydrocycle or water cycle based on trees and transpiration and evaporation, there's a whole lot of water that cycles without going into the ocean. Mm-hmm. And this should make a significant difference to the whole issue of climate and food production, and of all the potential fertility measures, there's no measure that brings more fertility than good rainwater. None at all. It's number one. And so without it, we die. With it, we flourish. Mm. And so we need to be able to make our soil like a sponge that can hold the moisture when it comes. And what is transpired by a tree is really, really clean water.
Yeah.
And that engenders the possibility of getting clean rain back down again. Walter Jehne, Jehne, who's been a scientist for most of his life, mentions that trees also give off bacteria that are capable of seeding clouds, and so with this tree transpiration we also have automatically the means for it to condense back into rain again much more readily than what blows a long way inland from the sea, because the other thing that helps to seed clouds is the salt from the sea, where water evaporates out of the sea. And so that's basically the nub of where we need to go for climate management. What is really, really important is having more carbon in the soil. It's much more important than having less in the atmosphere. Carbon is probably the most important nutrient that a plant can get. If we get too little carbon in the atmosphere, plants will just get deserts again. We need carbon levels at least, if not higher than we have at the moment, to keep our planet green and moistened in the right way. Taking carbon or trying to strip carbon out of the air is absolutely and totally disastrous for humanity. It will create us, the biggest desert that's possible, and that's without going into the effect of radio waves and that potential source of heating, because all of this supposed heating and drying of our environment also runs absolutely parallel to the increase in the use of electronic communication. And so this should be thoroughly investigated before trying to strip carbon out of the atmosphere. And what is toxic from the fumes that get into the air is not the carbon dioxide, it's all the other elements that get in there.
Right.
And starting with toxic agriculture doesn't help this process at all, because one of the most common sprays that are used, commonly called Roundup, is now got into the atmosphere in such a way that it's causing problems everywhere, and without the benefit or supposed benefit. Councils and large producers of food and even home gardeners are using it with gay abandon because they still believe the manufacturers' words telling us that it is harmless and quite safe for us to use. There's many people with digestive problems who can tell you otherwise. And the increase in digestive incompatibility with food has increased parallel to the use of chemical agriculture.
If all this CO2 in the atmosphere perhaps origins from the soil they treated bad, so we started with soils all over the world from about 15-16% humus, came down to 2%, and what's in between?
In some cases 0.5.
Now it's in the air, and the reason for this is
nitrogen is a big one.
Nitrogen, extreme tilling, and all the other chemical fertilizers. If you could show this,
short-circuiting the system.
Yeah, nothing. This had not much to do with diesel engines and so on.
Yeah,
it's the CO2 set free from the soil.
Yeah, and I collected soil samples for a relatively short time, and in that time I distinctly saw a diminishing of soil organic matter, which is about 25% carbon.
And they cheated us in the way they told us it's all about tilling. No, it's together with chemical fertilizers. The extreme use of chemical fertilizers is
it set the whole thing off in the first place.
In the first place.
Yeah.
And you increase this with the tillage.
Yeah. And the as I said to one of the younger groups that very much, climate change has got to be fixed, said, well, a whole lot of other things, and if you fix the wrong thing, you don't actually fix the problem.
Yeah.
But you cause another problem.
Yeah.
And
so
you need to be very careful that your understanding of your supposed problem is accurate.
Yeah.
And
it's about gaslighting and from these chemicals.
Well, they have a product to sell, so when somebody tells you a story, the first thing you ask is who's paying you, what product are you selling? Where does your money come from? These are very, very important questions when you're assessing a philosophy.
Yeah.
And so that's, and when somebody tells you that they are the single source of truth, you have to suspect them of being the worst liars out,
Yeah.
because the single source of the most truthful is God, is the spirit world. They do not handle deception at all well. That it's very, and as we're hearing today, that when you tell a lie, you create a demon. And
That is a really good quote. I like it.
yeah,
When,
Yeah, I mean, imagine.
I asked years ago the question: is a lie? Can you measure a lie with any device, with a certain device? Is it possible, in a perhaps physical way, to say this is a lie with a lie scanner?
yeah,
Not with a lie detector in the old way, but with a sophisticated machine. It runs to the TV show, and you say, "Oh, this is the lie."
yeah. Well, I mean, that was lying behind the whole of what this lecture was talking about today, was that we need to develop the organs to be able to
Yeah.
perceive these other things. That's what the exercises are for. Our eyes were given, our ears were given, but we still had to develop them to make them useful. And a nose for smell organism and taste organism. I mean, little babies, they're really acute. As you get older, they get less and less, particularly when you get your third set of teeth installed. and so chasing moths.
Oh, okay.
Not very good for the digestion, but never mind.
But for
So
the fun.
feel that we sort of, we'll start to ramble if we go on much longer in this
Yeah.
session.
Well, I think this is good. And I do have one question here about they have the rights. Do they still exist, US?
Oh yes,
Yeah, yeah.
So wouldn't it be a good idea to contact them for like a second edition, or do you think that
Well,
you wouldn't want to go that way?
how would that work? We write it as a group, and then we ask them to publish it again, or
I mean,
how are
did
you going?
did
What's
they?
your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know what's your arrangement with them. Did they give you like upfront money to write the book? Because sometimes publishing houses do
No,
that.
I didn't get any upfront money to write it. We wrote it and then offered it.
Oh, okay. And then they accepted it.
Yeah, and they said, "What a wonderful idea."
And then now, whenever you get a certain percentage of whenever the book is sold, you get a certain percentage of the price, right?
A royalty, they call it.
Your royalty, right? Okay.
It's a very small payment, but it's still.
I know. Normally,
Yeah.
I mean,
And the book has just about stopped selling. No, they sell
Oh.
very few copies. I think I sell more than all the rest of them do.
okay, because they don't really market the book anymore.
No,
Okay.
no, it's old news, and so what we're looking at is refreshing it. There's still a similar theme, but we could probably give it a better title to make it more broad in scope,
Yeah. So,
because it was never intended to be just for pasture, but
Yeah.
pasture has been my big experience.
yeah. Right.
The old wine in new bottles.
Yeah, that's the one. With a brand new label on it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean that we can think about that. One way would be to ask them, and another would be just to self-publish it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, not
We